Hello, I'm Mel Jones, the Associate Director of the Virginia Center for Housing Research at Virginia Tech. Thank you so much for having me back to do another housing study. As you may remember or know, we did a study back in 2016. Now we're kicking off a new study, a chance to do an update and take a little bit of a different focus. This time around, we'll kick off the study with public engagement. We'll be having meetings both in person and virtually. Then we'll have a survey to follow. Simultaneously, we'll be working on data analysis. We'll do market basics and a housing needs assessment, very similar to what we did in 2016, just taking a look at the trajectory since then and asking the question how things have changed. Then we'll be adding two new pieces of analysis. A naturally occurring affordable housing analysis. We'll look at every unit in Virginia Beach and think about how much will be required to afford that unit. And we'll do a workforce housing analysis. So we'll think about every occupation in Virginia Beach, how much folks earn in those occupations, and how much housing they can afford. As we get to spring and into summer, we'll be doing expert engagement. This is a very important part of our process. It helps us reflect on our data analysis and ask questions like, is it accurate? Does it match what people experience on the ground? And do we need to go a little deeper in any given subject? You guys will be helping us with that today as well. We'll talk in expert engagement with builders, realtors, lenders, representatives from the business community, housing service providers. We'll also have a chance to talk with elected officials. Then we'll begin strategy development once we have all of our qualitative and quantitative data analysis complete. And finally, we'll draft up a report. So why are we thinking about housing? Why do we keep doing these housing studies and developing strategies for improving housing affordability? Well, it has to do with federal devolution. Increasingly, state and local governments are responsible for providing social assistance programs, and in particular, housing. In the 2000s, Congress has over time reduced the amount of federal spending in this realm. And so local governments have partnered with private enterprise and non-governmental organizations or nonprofits to help provide housing in their cities. And while housing is a national issue, we hear about housing crisis across our country all the time in the news now. It needs to be addressed at the regional and even local levels, because the differences between markets and differences between cities and even differences between neighborhoods mean that the strategies for addressing housing challenges are very different at those levels. That and local governments are set up to provide these programs. So it makes sense to think about it at the local level. And why does it all matter, right? So when we don't have enough affordable housing, families, households accept substandard housing in order to access housing at all. Families sacrifice other necessities in order to pay for housing. And when they do that, the instability that causes has developmental consequences for children, really health implications for the entire family, and economic implications for the entire family. Households are more mobile than the housing stock. They can move around and make the best housing choices based on their budget. And so very often, if someone can't afford housing in one city, they will start looking around and considering leaving. That has implications for businesses. It's harder to attract and retain employees when they look at your housing market and they can't afford a place to live, or they've been here for a while and rents are increasing so much that they have to think about going somewhere else. They may move to a different city and commute in, which we all know results in traffic congestion. And in the long run, this will limit the economic growth of a place. Thank goodness, the flip side is also true. So when we do have affordable housing, people are more likely to, for example, invest in their educational enrichment. I didn't say this in the last slide, but When people spend too much on housing, more than 30% of their income on housing, they're less likely to fill a prescription. In general, affordable housing means healthier, more stable households, families, and that means better educational attainment, better career attainment, and more financial stability. And this has implications for the city at large to have healthier workers, kids achieving better grades and attending school more regularly. All of that has good implications for our schools and for our economy and businesses, but it also comes down to the neighborhood level. So when folks have affordable housing, they have extra funds to maintain and upgrade their housing over time. Housing needs to be upgraded about every 10 years. And so we need to consider this because as a city, most of our housing stock is existing. And if we don't maintain that housing and upgrade it over time, it has negative consequences, again, for the entire city's ability to attract and retain people. We'll also have a healthier, better workforce. And is housing affordability an issue in Virginia Beach? The simplest measure of housing affordability is cost burden. HUD says if you spend more than 30% of your income toward housing, you're cost burdened, housing cost burdened. And they say that if you spend more than 30% of your income for housing, you're cost burdened, then you may have to make choices between housing and other necessities. That's the situation that we want to avoid. So here in this graph, you have 5-year estimates. That means we've used 5 years of pooled ACS data to make an estimate for each dot here. In part of this graph, you see a dotted line. That is indicating the change that we're not totally sure about between 2019 and 2021. So the census, this data comes from the American Community Survey, which is a census product, deemed 2020 data to be experimental. And you can imagine why that's the case. A lot of people were not in their primary residence in 2020. They went to stay with family. They moved to their vacation home in response to the pandemic. Also, there was lots of uncertainty about how the data was going to be used, meaning there was a lower response rate. The response rate was affected enough by the pandemic that the census called this data experimental. So we are not considering that data reliable. And so we just jump right from 2019 to 2021 with our line. And I mentioned we used 5-year pooled data. This makes a very smooth trend line over time and allows us to evaluate the long-term trends in affordability in places that we study. So here you'll see in 2021, about 47% of Virginia Beach city renters were cost burdened. And that's greater than the state level, if you take the state as a whole. And about 25% of owners were cost burdened. Again, greater than the state as a whole. Now, during the pandemic, lots of things shifted that impact people's housing situations. So we had a lot of people whose employment ceased. We had a lot of people furloughed or laid off, and that really impacted the housing affordability of folks. And in response, state and federal government started creating safety nets for folks. Think emergency rental assistance that happened for a few years following sort of the onset of the pandemic. But after post-pandemic, if you will, some people never regained their job. Some people shifted their career or made choices about how many workers would be in their household that were different than prior to the pandemic. And then we had what we call a great retirement. So a lot of things have changed. And since we did have that rental moratorium where you couldn't evict people and you couldn't increase rents as quickly, we have a lot of folks following the pandemic, a lot of landlords essentially trying to catch up in order to pay their mortgage, meet their commitments. And so things have really shifted in recent times. And if we want to look at how those shifts have impacted places, we need to look at 1-year data. So up here on this slide, I've now shown you 1-year data for 2017, 2018, 2019, skip 2020 again, and 2021. And really what I want to point out to you here is the change from 2019 to 2021. You had a 4% increase in total households. Meanwhile, you had an 11% increase in cost-burdened households. So you have households that have been in Virginia Beach becoming cost-burdened. In 2019, 32% of households, all households, were cost-burdened, and in 2021, 34%. And I just want to add a little bit, in order for you guys to think back to the first graph. In 2021, 24% of owners were cost burdened, 52% of renters were cost burdened. So if we go all the way back, we think about that 25 and 47, now 24 and 52. Things have continued to get a little bit better for owners. Now that interest rates are going up, we'll see less refinancing, less improving affordability for owners. But things have really gotten quite worse for renters. So that's just a snippet, and we really want to hear today about how all of these trends, everything is impacting you and your household, or the folks that you work with, the folks that you serve, what you observe in the city. Qualitative data is really important to research for 2 reasons. One, we want to assess the validity of our analysis. We want to evaluate whether or not we have looked at the data and analyzed it correctly. And then we want to add depth to our understanding of the trends and data. So the perceptions and experiences and observations that you offer will help us do that testing, evaluation, give us examples to talk about, and guide additional or more in-depth analysis. For example, if some of you bring up topics that we hadn't planned to think about in this study, then we might add them in. We might go a little deeper on seniors, or go a little deeper on extremely low income households. So what you're saying today will actually impact the analysis that we do. However, we will not quote you or attribute any experiences to individuals. Essentially, we want to retain the anonymity of anyone participating here. So your name or identifying information will not be recorded with the information you share. You signed in when you came in, but the people who are taking notes today will not be writing, Mrs. Jones said X, Y, and Z. Instead, a participant mentioned X, Y, and Z. And then we'll analyze all of this data as a set. So from all of the meetings, in person and virtual, we'll take all of that information without attributing it to individuals, analyze it as a set, and present it as a synthesis, really talking in general terms. So we thank you for being here today. Again, your input, your feedback, your insights will help us as we move forward in this study. And if you have any questions or feedback, there are staff here today, but also you can feel free to contact me, Mel Jones, and there's my email address, or Sharon Schaaf with the city, and her email address is here too. So thank you again for participating in our study, and we look forward to sharing the results with you as we move along. Thanks again.